You tell me how a president in the middle of a pandemic has got time for this bullshit. Are you kidding me? Hawking products?
Yes, up, kissing my ass. They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir. And then
Trump panicking as Korea, now thinking of leaving the USA alliance to join BRICS. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. For most of its existence, the BRICS acronym was a term confined to economic journals and diplomatic circles. To the average person, it was a dry, academic grouping of faraway nations. It was the brainchild of a Goldman Sachs economist, a prediction of future growth, not a declaration of war on the established order. But somewhere along the way, that acronym, once a simple financial label, began to take on a life of its own. It became a symbol, not of a new global financial system, but of a new kind of defiance. It became the rallying cry for a world tired of living in the shadow of Western dominance, a quiet revolution simmering just below the surface. To nations across the global South, BRICS was more than an alliance of emerging economies. It was a promise of a seat at a different table, where the rules weren't set by old colonial powers. It was a rejection of a world order that had for too long felt like a one-way street, where they were expected to follow the lead of the G7 nations without question. The emotional pull was undeniable. It spoke of dignity, of self-determination, and of a shared future free from the constraints of a system that often felt exploitative. This is the context that brings us to a quiet, unassuming man named Deion. He was not a world leader or a military general. He was a career diplomat, a civil servant who had spent his life navigating the complex and often unforgiving halls of international relations. He had studied in the West, had a deep respect for American institutions, and believed in the foundational principles of the U.S.-South Korean alliance. To him, the partnership was an ironclad guarantee of his nation's security and prosperity. But recently, a new current had been running through the diplomatic corridors of Seoul, a current that made him uneasy. It began with the seemingly trivial, a shift in the language used in official communiques, the subtle reprioritization of certain trade deals, the increasing frequency of low-profile meetings with counterparts from Moscow and Beijing. Kim had been a loyal soldier of the system, a man who saw the world in black and white. There was the alliance, and there was everyone else. But as he watched these small, incremental changes, he felt the ground beneath his feet beginning to shake. The first whisper came to him in an encrypted message, an informal invitation to a meeting with a high-ranking Chinese official. The subject line was vague, the message even more so. It spoke of a discussion on multilateral economic cooperation. Kim had seen these before. They were usually a prelude to a trade proposal or a request for a new investment. But this time, something felt different. The tone was not one of negotiation, but of shared understanding, a quiet suggestion that they were both facing similar challenges. The meeting took place not in an official government building, but in a nondescript private club, the kind of place where business is done with a handshake and a nod, not a camera flash. The Chinese official, a man named Li Wei, did not speak of tariffs or market access. He spoke of history, of a world in which some nations had always been treated as more equal than others. He spoke of the sanctity of sovereignty, a phrase that resonated deeply with a Korean nation that had so often been a battleground for foreign powers. And then he said it, the phrase that would become the first tremor of a coming earthquake. Your people have a choice, Mr. Kim, to remain a pawn in someone else's game, or to become a player in your own. The word BRICS was not mentioned directly. Not yet. But the subtext was impossible to ignore. Li was speaking of an alternative future, a way out of the very dilemma that had been keeping Kim awake at night. The question that lingered in the air after the meeting was a moral one. Was he a patriot for listening, for even considering an alternative to the system that had protected his nation for so long? Or was he a traitor, secretly entertaining a proposal that would be seen by his American allies as an unforgivable act of betrayal? The internal conflict gnawed at him. He knew the risks. He knew the potential for American retaliation, the economic havoc, the diplomatic isolation. But he also knew the quiet despair of his people, the feeling of being trapped between two giants, with a constant sense of dread that they could be sacrificed at any moment for the sake of a larger geopolitical strategy. He had read the polls, heard the whispers on the street. A growing number of his countrymen no longer saw the U.S. alliance as an unassailable shield, but as a gilded cage. They saw a world in which their economic success had made them a target, not a partner. They saw a U.S. that was increasingly focused on its own internal conflicts, a nation that might not be willing to fight for them if the worst came to pass. And so, Kim Dae-hyun made a choice. It was not a grand gesture of defiance. It was a simple act of curiosity. He decided to continue the conversation. He began to discreetly gather information, to reach out to other, lower-level diplomats in the BRICS nations. He learned of the new development bank, an alternative to the World Bank. He heard of the proposed common currency, a way to bypass the dollar and its vulnerability to sanctions. He saw a picture of an alliance that was not just about challenging the West, but about building something new, something that would benefit its members directly, without the burdensome political conditions or moral judgments that often came with Western aid. This journey of discovery was a lonely one. He could not speak to his superiors about it. He could not tell his colleagues. He was operating in a moral gray zone, a place where the lines between loyalty and patriotism became blurred. He felt a deep sense of guilt, of deceiving the very people he had sworn to serve. But he was driven by a powerful conviction that his nation's future was at stake, and that to ignore this potential path would be a far greater sin. He was a man who had dedicated his life to preserving the status quo, and he was now secretly becoming an architect of its destruction. This is the true genesis of the Trump panic. It wasn't a sudden event. It was the culmination of a long, emotional, and very human struggle. It was the story of a man who saw the cracks in the foundation, and who, with a heavy heart, decided to explore what lay beyond the walls of the fortress he had spent his life defending. To understand South Korea's momentous decision, one must first appreciate the delicate and often suffocating tightrope it has been walking for decades. The U.S. South Korea alliance, forged in the crucible of the Korean War, was more than just a military pact. It was the very foundation of modern South Korea's identity. The presence of tens of thousands of American troops was a tangible symbol of a shared commitment, a promise of protection against the ever-present threat from the North. But over the years, what began as an alliance of necessity evolved into a relationship fraught with unspoken resentment. The partnership, from Seoul's perspective, often felt less like a collaboration and more like a dependency. The feeling of being a pawn was not an abstract concept. It was a deeply ingrained national anxiety. South Korea's economy had exploded in the post-war era, transforming it from a poverty-stricken nation into a global powerhouse, home to technological giants and cultural innovators. Yet, for all its economic success and newfound swagger, Seoul still felt constrained. Its foreign policy options were always filtered through the lens of what would be acceptable to Washington. Trade deals, diplomatic overtures, even domestic political decisions were often made with one eye on American approval. This was the gilded cage that Kim Dae-hyun had begun to see so clearly. The primary source of this emotional tension was the financial burden of the alliance. While the U.S. saw its military presence as a costly investment in a key strategic region, many in South Korea saw it as a perpetual tax on their sovereignty. For years, the two nations have been locked in a seemingly endless cycle of special measures agreements, where Seoul contributed billions of dollars to the cost of stationing American troops. Each negotiation was a painful, public spectacle, with U.S. officials, particularly during the Trump administration, often demanding more and more, sometimes in the form of what felt like threats. The rhetoric from Washington framed South Korea as a free rider, a wealthy nation not paying its fair share for its own defense. This was not just a diplomatic dispute. It was a deeply personal slight. The South Korean people, who had endured so much to build their nation, felt their sacrifices were being dismissed and their sovereignty disrespected. And then there were the geopolitical pressures, which were becoming unbearable. South Korea was caught in the middle of a deepening technological and economic war between the U.S. and China, its two largest trading partners. As the global supply chain fractured, Seoul found itself in an impossible position. American pressure mounted to cut off trade with China, particularly in critical sectors like semiconductors, while its own economy was